Hello. For the last couple of classes, we've been looking at the development of the Greek world and the distinctive political and cultural forms that developed in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. But during the same period that Greek society is developing, we find another important civilization developing in the central Mediterranean region. This, of course, is ancient Rome. In one form or another, ancient Rome, or at least the legacy of ancient Rome, will be with us for the rest of this course. Part of the reason for this comes from the fact that it's not really clear when the Roman Empire ends. Depending on who you ask, you get different answers. In Western civilization classes like this, it's traditional to say that the Roman Empire ended with the last Roman emperor, a fellow called Romulus Augustulus, and he's deposed by a barbarian general named Odovacar in the year 476. But that's only part of the story, as we'll see. In the first place, that's just what happened in the western part of the Roman Empire. The eastern part, centered in Constantinople, lingers on in one form or another until the year 1453, and then it's overrun by the Ottoman Turks. But in the west, we have another political entity that begins on Christmas Day 800, and this calls itself the Holy Roman Empire. As we'll see later on in this course, the Holy Roman Empire is actually a very strange creature. But the Holy Roman Empire sees itself as a direct successor, the direct heir of the Roman Empire, even though its heartland is centered in the Germanic parts of Europe, not in Italy. And this Holy Roman Empire limps on in one form or another until the year 1806, when Napoleon finally gets rid of it. But there's another successor of the Roman Empire, and this one is still with us. And that's the papacy. The papacy, of course, has its headquarters in the traditional capital of the Roman Empire, which, if you think about it, is really quite a strange development. Because Jesus Christ never went to Rome. He didn't actually have very much to say about the city of Rome either. Yet the headquarters of Christianity, Roman Christianity, is based in Rome. But it's not just this coincidence of capital city that makes the papacy one of the direct heirs of the Roman Empire. The Pope himself styles himself as Pontifex Maximus. That's a term that the Romans used to designate the highest priest in their ancient religion. It's a pagan title originally. The Roman Church has bishops. Bishops preside over dioceses, and dioceses are an administrative unit of the Roman Empire which develops in the 4th century. Ironically, they're named after the Emperor Diocletian, and Diocletian is responsible for one of the worst persecutions of Christians. In fact, the popes, through the Middle Ages, from the 12th century into the 16th century, consciously style themselves, as we'll see, as Roman emperors. So for all of those reasons, it's actually very difficult to put a definitive date on the end of the Roman Empire. But the cultural legacy of the Roman Empire is equally profound. Latin, the language that the Romans spoke, the language that the Romans read, that remains the language of all educated Europeans into the 17th century. In fact, the last important work written in Latin was Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, the work in which he lays out his laws of motion, and that's published in the year 1687. More profoundly than just the legacy of Latin, we've got the legacy of Roman law. That's still with us as well. With the exception of England, Roman conceptions of law underlie the legal systems of many European states. And if you go to Quebec today, you'll see that civil law there is grounded upon Roman law. And we've even appropriated some old Roman institutions, political institutions. The idea of a republic was a Roman innovation. and we'll be talking about Republican Rome in this video. But in places like France, Italy, Ireland, Canada, the United States, there's a branch of government called the Senate. And that's another Roman institution. In many ways then, the legacy of ancient Rome is just as profound as the legacy of ancient Greece, perhaps even more so. And we'll be coming back to the Romans again and again through the course of History 201. In this sense, the ideal of Rome lurks like a spectre hanging over the European Middle Ages, Renaissance and Reformation. One of the reasons for Rome's early success hinges upon geography. This is a satellite view of Italy. And as you can see in this satellite view, there's a long mountain range which runs up the length of the entire Italian peninsula. This is called the Apennine Mountains. What this means is if you try to travel the length of the Italian peninsula, you have no choice but to proceed either up the plains that run along the eastern or the western coasts. And if you proceed up the western coast, you must pass through the region known as Latium, which is here on the map. This is the location of Rome. So by virtue of its location along this western corridor of the Italian peninsula, Rome's always going to play an important role in trade along the Italian mainland. So it occupies a very important strategic location. Ancient Rome itself occupied a group of hills that overlooked the river Tiber. This means that the city has easy access to water, and its mountainous location means that the site is relatively easy to defend. Archaeologists have found burial sites on these hills which date back as early as about 1000 BC. So this suggests that the region was inhabited by a fairly sophisticated culture by quite an early date. By about 800 BC, we see these burials are actually getting closer and closer together. And this suggests that a larger, more organized community is developing. And at this time as well, around about 800 BC, we begin to find shards of Greek pottery. And so this suggests that the people who are living in this region are beginning to trade. They're beginning to look outwards and trade with their neighbors. And remember, of course, that as we saw, the Greeks have colonies in the south of Italy by this time. So they're not necessarily sailing off to the Greek mainland. They might be trading with Greek colonies in the south of Italy. Recent excavations have found evidence of large clay and timber walls intended to enclose part of the city, dating from the middle of the 8th century BC. And these walls are replaced by stone walls in the 7th century BC. And from the end of the 7th century BC, we begin to find the remains of large stone buildings as well. This all suggests that what's developing is a very sophisticated society. A society that can organize large numbers of skilled or semi-skilled peoples and put them together to build enormous public buildings. Archaeology is a very important source for these early societies, but it can only take us so far. In the case of ancient Rome, at least, the archaeological record needs to be supplemented by the writings of Roman historians. But the problem is, the writings of Roman historians that have survived don't date from this period. They come much later. As we'll see, the Romans do many things very, very well. They're politically brilliant. They win important military victories. They laid the groundwork for an incredible civilization. But the Romans never got around to writing their own histories until around about 200 BC. So if we're talking about the origins of the city in the 8th century BC, we're really talking about historians who are writing 500 years after the fact. So what these Roman historians tell us about the origins of the city is pretty dubious stuff. There's a lot of oral tradition in there, mixed up with myths and legends. But if the histories are pretty dodgy, they do tell us a lot about the ideals and the values of these people, how they saw themselves. When we looked at Homer, we saw that he thought of the distant past as a golden age. Remember, he's writing about the Trojan War set there around about 1200 BC, and he's writing 400 or 500 years after that. The Greeks, for Homer, who fought in the Trojan War, are archetypes. They're idealized characters. They're taller, stronger, braver, better looking than modern-day Greeks. For Homer, the past is a golden age that we need to aspire to, that we need to live up to. But the Romans saw their past in completely different terms. Their distant past wasn't a golden age like that described by Homer. At the end of the 1st century BC, a man named Livy was hired by the Roman Emperor Augustus to write a complete history of the city of Rome, up to his own day. What Livy completed was truly monumental. The whole work ran to 142 books and traces the history of Rome from its beginnings in the year 753 BC to his own day, 9 BC. Unfortunately, most of these books haven't survived. Only 45 are extant, and those nearly didn't even survive. They were rediscovered in monasteries by a fellow we'll meet down the road, a fellow called Petrarch, who's one of the first stars of the Italian Renaissance. They're rediscovered in the 14th century. What Livy tells us about the beginnings of the city of Rome is this. Round about the middle of the 8th century BC, the region around the city was ruled by a king. This king was named Numitor. Numitor was a descendant, Livy says, of a refugee from the Trojan War. There's that Trojan War again. But Numitor wasn't Greek. Numitor was Trojan. So the Romans traced their origins back to the other side of the Trojan War to the Greeks, the losing side. Numitor, we're told by Livy, was a reasonable king, but he was deposed by his jealous brother, a man named Amulius, who was deposed in a coup d'etat. And as soon as he gets power, Amulius is determined to keep it. So he locks Numitor up. Then Amulius kills off Numitor's sons, and he forced his daughter, a woman named Rhea Silvia, to become a virgin priestess serving the goddess Vesta. She's to become a Vestal virgin, in other words. What Amulius is trying to do is he's trying to extinguish his brother's bloodline. But then Livy says the fates decided to intervene. They sent the god Mars, the god of war, to impregnate Rhea Silvia. And 9 months later, she gave birth to twins. They're called Romulus and Remus. Naturally, Amulius was more than a little angry at this development, and so he had the two boys tossed into the river Tiber. But the story is the basket carrying these two boys is washed ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill. The boys were eventually found by a she-wolf who suckled the children and kept them alive. And then eventually they were found by a local shepherd who raised them as his own. This sculpture is part of the Capitoline Museum's collection in Rome. It's actually a very interesting piece in a lot of ways, partly because it's a composite. The she-wolf figure is generally thought to have been made around about the 5th century BC, although there's some new work which suggests it could be quite a bit later than that. But the figures of Romulus and Remus below, suckling on the wolf, those are added later in the Renaissance. Of course, you could probably guess the rest of this story, right? Through a series of adventures, the boys come before Numitor, and eventually they come to realize their real identity. And then they rise up and they slay Amulius and restore good old Numitor back on the throne. And then, for good measure, they decide to found a new city. And they chose the spot where they had been found when they were infants, the base of the Palatine Hill. And Romulus modestly has the city named after himself. So the legend is that Rome takes its name from Romulus. And a conventional date for the founding of the city of Rome is 753 BC. But it wasn't quite a happy ending, for the brothers fell out eventually, and Romulus, or one of his lieutenants, has Remus killed. So we have here a very different foundational myth to what the Greeks had talked about. The Greeks were heroic warriors fighting the city of Troy. Their history begins with the Greeks already great. The Romans, though, trace their origins to these two poor sons of refugees. And instead of military glory, the Romans begin in poverty and simplicity. So Livy's history really tells us the story of how people rose from such lowly origins to become a great power, a great civilization that by Livy's day is reaching out to dominate the entire Mediterranean. As a result of this very different foundational myth, there's often a deep ambivalence amongst educated Romans about the problem of conquest and about the massive empire that they begin to amass. These conquests made them staggeringly wealthy, absolutely, as we'll see. But the wealthier they became, the further from their pure, simple origins that they moved. One element of the Romulus and Remus story that is certainly true is that from the earliest days, Rome is ruled by kings. We know this because rex, the Latin word for king, appears in two 6th century texts. One's a partial inscription, partial religious inscription. The other's on a shard of pottery. And then we have this. This is a fresco from around about 500 BC. What we have are two men wrestling over a pile of 3 cauldrons. Probably the cauldrons were intended as the prize in this wrestling bout. But the interesting fellow is the one on the left, the one wearing the cloak. He's interesting because he's holding in his hand a curved staff, which is known as a lituus. The lituus is actually a sign of kingship and a mark of a particular type of priest known as an augur. This fresco is part of a series which dominate a tomb complex known as the Tomb of the Augurs. So what we have then are a few pieces of data that tell us just a little bit about these kings. It's not much at all. But it does mean that at this time, in the 6th century, these people who are inhabiting the region around Rome are thinking and talking about kings. They see their kings as having a political role and a religious role as well. But the problem is, if we want to know more about these kings, we have to turn again to these Roman historians. Those Roman historians like Livy who are writing so long after the events they purport to describe. What these later Roman historians tell us is that these kings led the army in times of war, and that the kings were responsible for building some temples and other public buildings, and they rendered judgment in certain types of legal dispute. We're also told that these kings defeated many of the towns that surrounded the city of Rome, and they forced some of the people there to move into the city. But of course, as I said, these historians are writing a good 500 years after the events they're describing. What Livy says is that between the years 753 BC and 509 BC, Rome is ruled by a succession of 7 kings. The first of these kings was Romulus himself. But if this is right, that means that each of these kings would have ruled for an average of 35 years. This is a very violent age. It's highly unlikely that these kings were ever able to rule as long as that. It's quite likely that somebody would have bumped each individual king off at some point before then. There were probably, in the end, more than 7 of these kings. But Livy does seem to be right about one thing. This early period of monarchy ends round about the end of the 6th century BC. The story Livy tells us is this. He says the last of these kings was a notorious tyrant with the name Tarquinius Superbus. Around about the year 510, his son, a fellow named Sextus, raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. By all accounts, Lucretia was a paragon of womanly virtue, and so the rape struck her contemporaries as absolutely horrific. And for her part, Lucretia was so struck by the shame of this rape that she killed herself in front of all of her male relations. She thought that her being raped had brought dishonor on her and her family. This is a 2nd century silver plate that shows the suicide of Lucretia. The fact that somebody decided to have these tragic events memorialized 700 years after these events shows just how much this story still resonates with the ancient Romans. Lucretia had become a symbol in Roman society of feminine virtue and feminine honor. According to Livy, though, after she killed herself, this is what happened next. A man named Lucius Junius Brutus, one of her male relations, stood up. He drew out the knife from Lucretia's wound and, holding it up, dripping with gore, exclaimed, "By this blood, most chaste until a prince wronged it, I swear, and I take you gods to witness that I will pursue Tarquinius Superbus and his wicked wife and all his children with sword, with fire, and with whatever violence I may, and that I will suffer neither them nor any other person to be king in Rome." And that's exactly what he did. But with Tarquinius gone, the question was what to do after that. How do you rule a city without a king? How do you do the job of a king without a king? So the Romans are forced to invent a completely new system of government. And at the core of this new system of government is the idea that they should have no king. No one should be in a position down the road to become king again. Kings have too much power. Kings have no checks on their power. Kings become tyrants. They become like Tarquinius Superbus and his evil son Sextus. So then, what they decide to do after the death of Tarquinius, what they decide to do is to take all of the powers that had been associated with the king and then divide them between a larger number of people. Government would no longer be a matter of individual power. It would be a public issue. In Latin, you would say res publica. That's the root of our word republic. Republic is a term which it begins defined in a negative sense. It's defined as a state with no king. It's a state, by extension, free of tyranny. And the Romans were successful. The Roman Republic lasts for the next 500 years. Now, it's quite likely that this change from monarchy to republicanism doesn't take place as suddenly as the story of the rape of Lucretia suggests. But it is clear that by the early 5th century BC, Rome is not ruled by kings anymore. Instead of kings, at its height, Republican Rome is ruled by two men called consuls. You could easily identify a consul because they wore a special type of toga. It was embroidered with purple. They sat on a distinctive chair that was inlaid with ivory. And in public, they spoke on an elevated platform so that everybody could see them when they made their pronouncements. These men, of course, came from the very best families. Consuls were responsible for a whole pile of things. They were responsible for leading the army. And they had an array of religious duties as well that they were obliged to perform for the benefit of the state. And under certain circumstances as well, they were to preside as judges over particular types of legal cases. Consuls got their power by virtue of the fact that they were invested by the people with what was called imperium. This is the root of our modern word, imperial. In Latin, the term comes from the verb imperare, which means to order or to command. And that's precisely what imperium is. And that's precisely what consuls get. They're invested with the right to issue commands and the right to enforce them as well. This means that they have the power to fine people, to arrest them. It could also mean that they have the power to condemn them to death as well. In effect, imperium gives the consuls all of the trappings of power. It gives them the power to give orders and to exact obedience to them. In practice, though, the power of the consuls is actually quite limited. And this was the point. First of all, consuls would serve only for a single year. This meant that they really didn't have much time to manipulate the system for their own benefit. After a year, they were meant to be gone. Second, consuls didn't get their position by blood. They got it because they were elected. And third, the power of consuls is limited because there's two of them, which means that one consul can always veto the actions of another. In that way, no consul is going to become out of control. No consul is going to be able to raise himself up to become like a king. But this would also mean that the government of the Republic would always be conservative. There was no one in any position to push through radical reform, even if radical reform was needed. If just one of the consuls tried, of course, he'd be vetoed. But even if both consuls agreed that radical reform was necessary, they were only in position of power for just a year, not long enough to do it. This means that if there's any change in the system, it's going to be slow. It's going to be incremental. It's going to be piecemeal. And that's important, as we'll see. And it has to be in line with the will of the people. To help them govern wisely and cautiously, the consuls were advised by a body called the Senate. The term is related to the Latin word senex, which means old or old man. So the Senate is intended to be a council of elders. A council of elders which is meant to advise the consuls before they acted. According to legend, it begins when Romulus chooses 100 of Rome's elders to advise him and help him rule fairly and efficiently. And over time, the legend continues, the number of senators rises from 100 to 300. Over the life of the Republic, the role of the Senate evolves. It makes decisions in matters of religion. It receives diplomatic missions from allies and from enemies too, for that matter. And it decides the military assignments that are given to each of the consuls. Which consul would lead which army in which theatre of operations. But the first responsibility of the Senate was to supervise and to control the treasury, to control the purse strings of the Republic. No consul could get his hands on money for anything unless the Senate approved of it. In this sense, the Senate is another check on the power of the consuls. Unlike consuls, though, senators are appointed for life. Now, the Romans are certainly not idiots. They realize that sometimes it's going to be necessary for the state to respond quickly to some immediate sort of threat. If the barbarians are at the gate, for instance, you can't ask them to wait until you've held elections and courted the will of the people. The Romans appreciated this, and so they created an office called dictator. Now, put away any images you might have of Hitler working himself up into an apoplectic frenzy. That's not what we're talking about here. The word dictator literally means a man who speaks. In this case, the dictator speaks, but he speaks with the full weight of imperium behind him. A dictator would be appointed by the Senate as a figure of absolute authority. He would be able to hold complete, unchecked power in times of national crisis. But to make sure that the dictator never became a tyrant, the appointment would only last for 6 months. Together then, the consul and the Senate were the backbone of the Roman Republican system for the next 500 years. But as we'll see in the next video, the republican system is run through with a profound tension. A tension between two different social groups, the patricians and the plebeians, those who have and those who don't. These tensions forces the republican system to adopt and adapt and to accommodate them. But as we'll see in the next video, the republican system is run through with a profound tension. A tension between two different social classes, the patricians and the plebeians, those who have and those who don't. This tension forces the republican system to adopt and adapt over the next few centuries. But in the 1st century BC, as we'll see down the road, this tension is what will eventually come to rip the republic apart.